have to say that was such an energizing presentation from Secretary Pompeo. What a great way to start. Mary, thanks for the invitation. It's fantastic to be here. Thanks to Jennifer Schubert-Aiken and the entire team at the Steamboat Institute for this invitation. It's an honor to be here, to get to know you, to learn what this community is all about, and hopefully to play a little part in your thought process and where you go as an organization. It's also great to get out of DC, I have to say. This is a beautiful part of the state, and I've not been here before, so again, it's an honor. So as Mary mentioned, I'm going to spend some time talking about global supply chain issues and the connection to economic security, resilience, and America's standing in the world. There's a lot to talk about right now, a lot of things in flux, including a global trade order that is really rewiring. So we're going to dig into that. Just a little bit about FDD. If you don't know, the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, we're an independent, nonpartisan think tank. We're based in Washington, D.C., and we were formed after 9/11 with one very critical objective, which I think I don't need to pull any punches with this crowd. But our goal is to inflict pain on America's adversaries. It's to stop the role of authoritarians. Thank you. And we take that very seriously. What I focus on is the economic domain. So looking at the US and global financial system, the role of the US dollar and how important that is in peace and stability in the world, the role of sanctions and export controls, countering illicit finance, countering kleptocracy and corruption, which is an area that I've spent a lot of time on in my career. And looking at how we can use these tools of economic engagement, whether we're talking about economic warfare or the positive impact, the positive economic power projection of the US to combat authoritarians and malign influence. So that's really what we're all about. So I just want to share a couple of headlines. These will sound familiar, but I think it kind of makes the point about this notion that supply chains are now becoming a conversation at the dinner table. 20 years ago, when I was working on supply chain issues at the Department of Homeland Security, I ran the Office of Cargo and Trade for a period of time. And this was in the context of post-9/11. How do we secure our ports? Do we know if nukes are coming into this country? How do we get a handle on securing the borders? So at that time, it wasn't as, well, it just wasn't as sexy, all that work we did around supply chains. But now it's come into, I think, a broader conversation, and that's a very good thing. Whether we're talking about China putting export curbs on the US, choking off shipments of gallium, germanium, which happened just this past October. A headline, Russia stops Ukraine grain deal, shaking world food markets. We're all aware of the implications on global supply chains because of Putin's actions. Houthi attacks on shipping in the Red Sea, reigniting a global supply chain crisis. This is happening as we speak. And who can forget COVID? And I quote, China's export restrictions strand medical goods that the US needs to fight coronavirus, State Department says. That was April of 2020. So let me leave you with a couple of key points up front before we go into the story a bit further. We face some very serious supply chain vulnerabilities, critical supply chain vulnerabilities in this country, and we have to solve for them as quickly as we can. We need to define and rethink the approach, and again, we need to do it quickly. And this will require a different kind of conversation between the public sector and the private sector. Why? Because most decisions around supply chain risk are not decisions of the US government. They are decisions of multinationals and US companies. So we need to recognize that. When we talk about supply chain conflict, we're talking about the rules of engagement. And this is something that Secretary Pompeo really touched on. Who controls the rules of engagement? Who writes the rules of engagement? This is absolutely critical, whether we're talking about trade agreements, technology standards, how we have influence in the maritime domain, what our footprint looks like in commercial ports, how data flows through the trade system. These are just a few of the aspects that underwire, if you will, undergird the questions that we face around supply chain security. Political systems are still driving economic systems. I think this is a really important point. Sometimes we think about markets operating in and of themselves, but no, there's a system around that. It's about the rules-based order, but it's also around a fight for ideology. And we have to remember this. We are in a conflict around ideology, particularly with the Chinese Communist Party. It reflects in terms of these rules of the game that then influence the systems and how they operate. So we really can't get away from that. And we need to remember it, because I think it's part of how we address the solutions. When we think about moving supply chains back to this country, there's ample opportunity to do it. It's not consistent across all types of supply chains. We have some real opportunity, but we also have some areas where we are linked into global economic trade systems, primarily for our benefit, and we're going to have to continue to think about those and how to get the most out of it. So we need a longer-term approach to economic partnerships with allies and partners. We can't put those relationships at risk, but at the same time, our focus must be on building domestic resilience. It must be about protecting our security first. We have untapped potential. This is my final comment before we unpack it a little bit. We have untapped potential to build on the North America Free Trade Agreement for the benefit of the US, Canada, and Mexico. We have opportunity now to reset how we think about economic engagement in the Western Hemisphere. This is absolutely critical, because we need to look closer to home. If we want to build resilience, we can do that domestically, but we also need to do it in a way that is a bit closer to home. So let's go back to the COVID crisis back in early 2020. So at that time, in fact, I was just finishing up research that I had been working on for about a year. I wasn't full-time at FDD at that period. I was working as an advisor to the center that I now run. But they had given me some support to look at China's influence through what's called the Belt and Road Initiative. This is China's $1 trillion infrastructure project, which has conveyed a tremendous amount of infrastructure along with digital surveillance equipment, political influence, and much more into the global south. By the global south, we are talking about emerging economies for the most part, in Africa, in Asia, in parts of Latin America. So the reason that I was interested in doing this research on China's Belt and Road Initiative is because we were starting to see early signs of massive corruption in this program. Why is this problematic? Well, because when corruption becomes the process of moving trillions into the world from the Chinese Communist Party, it has the potential, and it did and continues to undermine the rules of engagement that the US has been trying to put in the global order for many, many years. And what was interesting at that point, going into 2020, was the number of instances of massive corruption, state-sponsored corruption, that were occurring in all parts of the world. And so I wrote a pretty lengthy memo about this and kind of went after this bad behavior, saying, this is offensive. It's creating a new cycle of extraction. It's creating new supply chains that Beijing will use not only to push infrastructure and Chinese equipment and technology out into the world, but it will facilitate political coercion on a much grander scale, and corruption greases all of this. It greases the skids. So about the time that this report was coming out, we went into lockdown. And that's when, of course, we all experienced what it meant to have scarcity of PPE, to wonder if our medical systems and equipment were going to be made available, if pharmaceuticals were going to be plentiful enough to take care. And we had shortages that followed. The baby formula challenge, ADHD medication became scarce. And we as Americans who have been used to living in this just-in-time environment with everything that we need, it became destabilizing. So when these two things were kind of playing out, and at least in my own world, this report that was coming out around China and corruption and the Belt and Road Initiative and this growing footprint, and then seeing what was happening at home and our inability to get PPE, for example, out of China, it really sparked some thinking about how are we going to rewire? How are we going to create a new normal in this environment where we don't know what the next global shock might be? Maybe it is another pandemic, but maybe it's a financial shock. Maybe it's war. We don't know. But what we do know is that at some point we're going to be facing another major global challenge. So how do we get ourselves prepared for that? And I started talking about this with an old colleague of mine, a gentleman named John Austin, who is a researcher at the University of Michigan. We're both from Michigan. I grew up just outside of Detroit. He grew up closer to Ann Arbor. And over the years, we've written together around the industrial base of this country, revitalizing the industrial heartland. What does it mean to bring more good jobs to this country? How do we get focused on co-producing more broadly? And we took some of these ideas that we'd been thinking about for a long time and put it in a frame of what we called ally shoring. And this is where the story starts for today. Ally shoring, what is it? It's this idea that we can co-create production systems, we can protect critical supply chains by working more closely with allies and partners, those that are democratically aligned, rooted very, very clearly in the rules and norms that bring partners together. Within the context of ally shoring, we also talked about and have written about the importance and the promise of reshoring. There are lots of opportunities to do that. But when it comes to working with allies and partners, whether we're talking about Canada or Mexico or partners in Asia or Europe, and there are many of them, as Secretary Pompeo said, we have to think longer term about economic integration, and we have to think about systems that allow us to build the industrial base of our country and allow our partners to do the same. It's not a zero-sum game. We have to do this together. And this is ultimately, we think, the way to reinforce and strengthen democratic rules-based systems. We have to really put the focus on that. So we started thinking about this and decided to put an article out into the world about ally shoring and what it means. And we didn't know if anybody would pick it up. We just wrote it. And Newsweek ran it in mid-2020. And we thought, OK, that's great. Got something out there. Let's see, maybe we'll write something else about it. Then the calls started coming in. And more organizations and a group of US and Mexican manufacturers reached out. And we started getting calls from really interesting people all over the country. And we ended up kind of going out on the road for about a year and a half to talk to people all over. We went to Kansas. We went to South Dakota. We went to Detroit. We kind of covered the gamut with, especially with a focus on the industrial heart of this country. And this concept of ally shoring really gained some momentum. So when the Biden administration came in 2021, we saw that this concept of friendshoring appeared, which was kind of a take on ally shoring. I think they needed to put it in their own words, and that's OK. It's not exactly the same thing, but the basic approach is similar. But what we lost in this kind of reframing from ally shoring to what Janet Yellen and others have talked about as friendshoring is the alliance. And so that's kind of what we need to get back to. This is not about transactional activity with trade partners. This is about building an economic base that stands the test of time. That's what this is about, and really rooting it, again, in the industrial core of this country. And that means we need to think about not only how we're producing, but how we're training, what kind of skills we're building over time, how we think about labor and mobility. And these are very powerful ways to get into conversations that otherwise would be difficult. I'll give you an example. We're going to talk about the border crisis later. It's a really important topic. It's critical. for an ally shoring concept to work between the US, Canada, and Mexico, we need to have a fully functioning, secure, transparent border. There's no other way to do this. But how do we get there? It's difficult to get there around the current political dynamic. We have all the tools that we need as a country to fix the border situation. Maybe we need to think about it in terms of the stronger opportunity for economic integration and what that means, and why systems need to be improved, why we need more people at the border, and why we think about this as a problem for North America, not just for the southern border. So sometimes the framing really matters in terms of where you can take a conversation, how you get there, and ultimately what you can drive out of that. So let's go back now to a bit more around the supply chain question. And I want to spend a little time actually talking about energy, because this is a huge, huge challenge. And no matter how you think about energy and related supply chains, we have dependencies. Whether we're talking about oil dependencies that still exist between the US and the Middle East and OPEC countries, whether we're talking about the emerging situation around our dependencies on solar panels, critical minerals coming out of China, or even in this renewed conversation around nuclear, and going further around revitalizing nuclear capability, whether you agree with that or don't agree with that. A good chunk of the enriched uranium to run nuclear systems comes from Russia, and we still buy it. Okay, so if we think our challenges are challenging and problematic, you haven't been to Germany lately, it's even worse there, where these dependencies are even more difficult. But again, another reason to think about how we bring allies and partners into a broader conversation around how to address these issues. So one thing that we've been looking at FDD, more specifically around the clean energy supply chain, is exactly how bad is it with China when we think about the new supply chains for electric vehicles and batteries. We've actually done a deep dive on this. We created a new model to figure this out. Without going into a lot of the details, we're essentially measuring geopolitical risk. We can look at data to quantify China's influence over the US, China's influence over third countries like Chile, Bolivia, Argentina. These are potential pivot opportunities to move supply chains out of China, or at least some mining operations, maybe some production in the future. But if we make a pivot like that, are we creating another dependency? This is really the question. We have to be much more mindful of how these connections will be working out over time, and a decision between going after an agreement with the Chilean government versus the Bolivians, there's a huge discrepancy. And all we have to do is look at the data to see that actually we're going to have a much harder time. And sure, on the surface, we can also see that a country like Bolivia, with a lot of untapped mining opportunity around lithium, could be a great partner for the US, but on the other hand, they have huge relationships with authoritarians that are extending their influence in Latin America and will make it difficult for us over time. So the whole point of the research is really to put a finer point on what does it mean to ally shore? What does it mean to take a move out of China into another country or back home? What are the costs and benefits of doing that, and how do we make better decisions? And one of the reasons I think this is so important is because we've seen what happens when we have legislation moving forward, the Inflation Reduction Act, for example, where there were huge subsidies around certain kinds of supply chains, but there were unintended consequences, particularly for allies and partners in Europe. So we need to balance all of that out, and it's complicated because we have many critical supply chains. Perhaps the first question we need to be asking is, what's critical? Not everything is. Do we care if our shoes are made in China? We probably don't. Do we care if 100% of our lithium processed lithium comes out of China? Yes, we absolutely do. So it's time to get prioritized around this. It also will require the US government to think differently about economic competition and how to address it. There are some nascent activities around this question of how do we get aligned for a whole of government approach to combating economic coercion from China in particular, but I can tell you it's a huge, heavy lift for agencies that typically work in silos. So there's a lot to be done there. But then going back to this question about the private sector, this is important because the answers don't necessarily lie within government. Some of the coordination does, but the actual decision about whether a supply chain is moved out of China is very much in the hands of the C-suite of an organization and the investors who sit on the board. So how do we get that community involved in the conversation around alignment of capital? Now, the really interesting thing about markets and open markets is that investors and companies do respond to risk. And we've seen something really interesting happening in China over the last 2 years, which is a huge amount of capital flight. So foreign direct investment in China is down over the last 2 years, something like 80%, maybe more. That's massive. It's one of the reasons Xi Jinping went to Silicon Valley and said, hey, we're here to be friends. And a lot of US CEOs paid $40,000 to sit at the table, which is unconscionable, really, if you think about it. But there's a war going on here, and a lot of it will come down to how public and private work together to address these issues. And we don't want to go towards a system where we have state-owned enterprises controlling everything, where we have members of the government sitting on the boards of corporations. We can't fathom this, right? I mean, it's the norm in China, but it's not our system. So how do we then begin to have alignment in a way that supports our economic security and our national security more effectively? We do need to answer that question. We can look at the market dynamics, this outflow of foreign direct investment from China, and look at where it's going. Mexico has seen a huge increase in FDI. That's probably a good thing. Although we also see that there are a lot of Chinese companies moving to Mexico. Why? Because it's a workaround to get to the North American market. So there are actions and reactions for everything that happens in a complex supply chain. And there are many dynamics that we're going to have to be looking at. But it calls for a broader view, along with a lot of expertise that's connected in a more meaningful way, especially in the US government. So where do we go with all of this? Well, we need to start thinking a bit more long-term about alliances, about partnerships, and how we address the specific choke points in supply chains that are particularly vulnerable and valuable to us. So if we go back to the question around EV batteries, for example, do we want to stay in battery technology that links us into lithium? Or do we want to put more money into sodium batteries? Sodium is more plentiful. There are downsides to sodium batteries, including the fact that they're not readily available yet. But there are these questions that are going to come up that we really need to think about more strategically. And that's where we do actually need the government saying a little bit more about that and helping to prioritize and pushing investment, using the levers of investment, whether that's through the Exim Bank or the Development Finance Corporation or other ways that we might incentivize certain emerging capabilities that will get us out of vulnerabilities that we don't want. So there's a lot of work to do. We need to prioritize that work. And we need to think about this question of co-production and where we have opportunity to drive a much deeper set of alliances around the world. So I'll leave it at that and look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Elaine. Here, please have a seat. Thanks, everybody, and please do send in questions, which I've got on this little gizmo here. And again, to our audience that's streaming, thank you for viewing. Well, it sounds like the theme of this conference is making America secure again. If Secretary Pompeo's remarks and your remarks are any indication. You've worked in the US government. Maybe I'll just kick it off and then we'll go to your questions. But is the US government really capable of doing any of this?
It's a fair question, Mary. It's a fair question. I suppose in a way my experience in the government was somewhat unique because my career took off in government after 9/11, where I was part of the stand-up of the Department of Homeland Security. And at that point, we didn't have much of a playbook post 9/11 for integrating a lot of functions across the government. I always felt like we were out on a limb trying to make the best decision with limited information. Eventually, we got there. You could argue it could have been done better. But I do think that's kind of the thematic. Eventually, we get there as a country, as a government. What's challenging right now is that we've taken our eye off the ball. So I'll give you an example. A lot of the work that we did after 9/11 to secure the ports, to put screening equipment in foreign ports to make sure that we didn't have threats coming in, we kind of pushed the border out. A lot of that focus has gone away because there was an assumption that the threat had changed or was mitigated. Actually, it didn't go away. It just took on a slightly different tact, if you will. And now we're looking at systems that aren't really made for this moment. So we have aging equipment. We have Chinese companies that are providing most of the screening equipment in ports around the world, for example, and it's difficult to compete against that. Along with screening equipment comes massive amounts of data that we don't have access to because they're going through Chinese systems. So it's going to be a tall task. On the other hand, there are pockets within the US government where there's a lot of activity around.
Where it actually works.
And where it actually works. So I think we need to be optimistic about that, but we also need to keep the pressure on to ensure that the imperative is there, that people are really coming into this within a frame of, hey, this is critical, there's a lot of work to be done, and we have to break down the silos to get there.
Lots of questions about your remarks on China, so we'll ask a couple of those, and thank you to the audience. This question concerns your work that you did with the so-called Global South, particularly Africa. Are we losing advantageous relationships with African nations that house key minerals because China's just giving huge loans and gifts, and we don't do that?
For sure. Absolutely, without question, that has happened, and it continues to happen. Is it getting a little bit better? Maybe, because the US has now taken on a bit more of a ground game to try to work in strategic environments, particularly places like the DRC, where we have huge equities in cobalt mining. There are certain points where around the world where we do need to pay particular attention. But the reality is that China has done so much to disrupt and coerce political dynamics their way, that it's not so easy to undo that quickly. And when the skids are constantly greased by various forms of corruption, it's hard for us to get at that because that's not how we operate. So we have to offer something better, right? This is the question. What's the offer from the US when it comes to working with the Global South? And here I think we have to go back to this question about how we want to operate in the world, what's core for us, for our rules-based engagement. And it's why anti-corruption is so darn important. People think this is an issue off on the margins. It's really not, because how we do business matters. And we need to keep the pressure on to keep systems transparent. And even if it's just providing technical assistance to countries that are trying to figure out whether a contract presented to them by a Chinese construction corporation is a good deal for them to sign, even that is helpful for us to be doing. So, when we look at what China is spending around the world through the Belt and Road Initiative, we're talking about, upwards of $1 trillion. We're not going to meet that threshold of investment. But I would argue we don't have to. We just have to be very, very strategic and asymmetric about where we go after that influence and how we choke it off.
The corruption point is so important, and it's something that we faced in the administration. But there is a different form of corruption. And again, thank you to the audience. This is an audience question, and it's a question of corruption over the influence and activities of US CEOs who, let's face it, are compensated on a short-term basis. They're focused on inflating their stock prices. And so their incentive is to go and inflate those stock prices as quickly as possible, and China's a big market. So how do we start to influence the C-suites, many of whom are starting to get out of China, but a lot of them aren't, particularly the big companies.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a lot in that question about corporate governance, but let me take the China piece of it. I'll go back to what I said about foreign direct investment leaving China. It is becoming riskier to make major investments, and a lot of companies are now pursuing what they call a China plus one strategy. So they may have, a supply chain in China, but they'll create a redundancy with a supply chain outside of China. I think we're going to see more of that. But what we have to do is make the costs go up, 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 up as it relates to geopolitical risk. And that's part of what we're trying to assess in the project that I mentioned that we've undertaken at FDD. How do we give better data to the private sector to make better decisions and price accordingly the risk of doing business in authoritarian regimes? We have to start quantifying that. Otherwise, it's not going into the risk calculation, and decisions are made that don't reflect the reality on the ground. Now, China's doing some of that work for us, which I guess is a little bit of a bright light. So they've kind of hunkered down on some of their laws, the national intelligence law, their due diligence law. Bottom line is they're making it difficult for Western companies to operate in China because it's hard to do basic deal due diligence now to try to get that information, right? It's very difficult. With the national intelligence law, pretty much any Chinese entity or individual operating anywhere in the world can become a spy of the Chinese government. So these are the kinds of things that build the risk. And where companies and CEOs in particular need to be more attuned to what the implications are for doing business. And quite frankly, we've lost way too much IP over the years to allow that to continue. So that should also be priced in properly. I'm not sure that we've ever really done that.
So you've talked about several actors here. We've talked about the US government, about allied governments, about the US corporate sector, but we have a question from the audience about international institutions, and these are important actors too. This question related to the World Bank. Are World Bank loans being used to build China's Belt and Road? And are there ways that we can take some of these international financial institutions to encourage the transparency that you've talked about?
Yeah, this is a tricky environment. So there probably are examples where Chinese money has been commingled with funds coming from international development institutions like the World Bank. Probably not many of them, but there are probably some examples of it. What's more important is that organizations like the World Bank have actually suffered from the bilateral deals that China has done through the Belt and Road Initiative, because these opaque deals don't align with how the World Bank and other finance institutions think about transparency, how to write a good contract, anti-corruption provisions, all the basics that we consider to be conditionality on the way that we lend don't necessarily apply in the case of BRI projects. So in that sense, what China offers is easy money. And it's another case where the World Bank is outcompeted by Chinese lenders. That's a situation that we need to put an end to. I can think of some cases in East Africa where the World Bank simply wasn't competitive in trying to provide funds for projects. The other thing that's happening is an erosion of project feasibility. So the BRI has been disastrous for debt distress in countries that have a lot of projects and have taken a lot of Chinese money. And this has just caused major problems because now a lot of these loans are coming due and they have to be restructured, but they're being restructured by the bank, by Chinese banks, at very high interest rates versus lower interest rates that typically come with World Bank or similar funds. So all of these dynamics are playing out in a way that just disrupts the entire environment of how international institutions are operating, and we've got a lot of work to do to clean that up.
We just can't get rid of them.
Yeah.
I guess that's not the world that we live in. Lots of your questions coming in again. Thank you. We have a Trump question. I don't know. I might skip that one. No. Well, maybe I'll ask it. Do you think if Trump is elected in 2024, a renewed trade war will resume with China? And what does that mean for our supply chains and our friendshoring?
Oh, I don't know. Honestly, I don't know how to answer that question. Is it more likely that we'll have imposition of tariffs if passed as prologue? Probably. Will that start a broader trade war? It could.
Could it have a benefit of accelerating the move to Mexico and Canada?
It depends. I think it depends on what the implications are for particular supply chains and how quickly a pivot strategy might happen. You know, it's a combination of things. It's not just a tariff. It's you know, what's happening on reshoring. Where do we want to make investments? It's a combination of things. So I think it's hard to say, but I would say it's more likely that we'll be in an environment of tariffs.
How easy is it to reshore if you're a manufacturer?
It can be straightforward and it can be extremely challenging. It really just depends on the sector that we're talking about. But the deeper the connectivity goes into a specific system of Chinese production, for example, critical inputs. You know, if we're talking about vertical integration, that might be more difficult to pull it out. In other cases, we have baseline industries in this country that just need a bit of a jump and could take up, you know, some of that slack. So again, I think we have to be careful about what it is that we define as critical. Maybe not everything needs to be reshored or ally shored for that matter, but some things really do because it's in our economic security interest.
Well, let's talk about that. I mean, obviously pharmaceutical inputs is a big one.
Yep.
You talked about critical minerals.
Yep.
Is there something else that goes on that kind of red blinking light list that we really need to reshore?
Well, I would, so I would look at it more broadly, not only a question of what gets reshored, but where are we putting new supply chains? So it's perhaps more important to think about the decision making for what's coming, whether we're talking about the emergence of quantum, AI, any sort of advanced manufacturing where we have serious innovation and IP that could potentially be at risk, where there's a link to the defense industrial base. That has to be deemed critical. So we need to look at it from that layer first and foremost. Then we have a lot of industries where we have cheaper production process. So most toys, for example, are made in China. That's a question. Do we care about that?
No, kids don't need to play, they need to work.
Yeah, exactly. So again, I think it's a matter of sort of picking and choosing. But first and foremost are really thinking about the technologies that are going to fuel the jobs of the future. This is really important and where we need to think about how we either keep them at home, bring them home, or keep them closer to home.
For those of you who haven't had the pleasure of working in the guts of the US government bureaucracy, what are the institutions or who are the people who are really not only just thinking about these things within the US government, but implementing solutions? Is that like mostly the Pentagon? Is it the Commerce Department? I mean, who do you interact with? Who's working on this stuff?
Yeah, it's a mix. It depends on what the issue is. So Department of Commerce is definitely having a moment these days, particularly around export controls, but thinking more broadly about supply chain resilience. So they opened an Office of Supply Chain Resilience not too long ago, and the idea is to work more closely with the private sector to establish risk thresholds. So that's important. State Department has a huge role because they're really in a key position to help build the ground game internationally. Because
they have economic cone employees all around the world in every embassy.
Yeah, along with the Department of Commerce through the Foreign Commercial Service. So there are a couple of agencies that have some international expertise and people out in the world who can help. But right now, that system is a little bit weak. We just haven't put a focus on that because industrial policy really hasn't been a core focus of that foreign engagement. So I think that has to change. Otherwise, we're going to have a hard time beating back against the coercion.
Is there a way, though, to respect, and again, this is from the audience, our free market system to encourage the private sector, which is, let's face it, really the power in America today, has always been and hopefully always will be, to take decisions that are in our U.S. national security to help make America secure again? Is that tax policy? Is it incentives? I mean, how do we use our system for good?
Yeah, It's a great question. I think that it's actually the question going forward around creating or rewiring this global supply chain environment in a way that preserves rules-based order, preserves markets, and allows us to operate in the way that we want. But we're not going to get there without some level of coordination, and this is the rub, right? We need to go a little bit further down this road of industrial policy and figuring out how to get that alignment between public and private sector without going so far that we have state-owned enterprises making, I mean, it's just we're not going in that direction.
We have Citibank.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you could
Nobody
make
laughed.
that.
That was a joke.
Yeah.
How does foreign labor fit into this discussion? Do we need to import people with the skills to build these new supply chains, or do we have that capability already in America?
So this is a really important question, and the answer is pretty clear. There's no way to keep economic resilience and economic security and growth without thinking about labor and thinking strategically. And we need to reframe the discussion around labor and labor mobility. And we can start by looking at that in North America. We don't have all the labor that we need, whether we're talking about enough engineers for emerging manufacturing, to workers to help pick fruit. We have some serious shortages, and we need to recognize that. There are different ways that we can solve for it. There will be a lot of innovation, and AI may change the nature of where we need jobs and how we skill people. But going back to Secretary Pompeo's comment about China now losing population, they will have a very difficult time responding to that. We have the ability to deal with it, and it's because we're a nation of immigration. Now, this is a separate question from do we need a secure border, which is unequivocally yes, we have to have it. In fact, it's even more critical to have the secure border to be able to talk about the immigration policies that we need to keep the economic engine going, to keep this country strong. So we need to start thinking about it much more strategically.
Are you optimistic?
Absolutely. Yeah, because it's America.
Well, maybe we should end on that because we need a positive note here. Would you all please join me in thanking Elaine for her expertise? Quite amazing, Elaine. Thank you for your